We're ready to start. Hi, everyone. My name is John Parker from the Socialist Unity Party and Struggle of Lucha for Socialism. And we're having a webinar today to discuss the situation around Hurricane Ida. And we have panelists that are going to be, some of whom were actually in the storm in New Orleans, and others who have witnessed the devastation of Katrina and Rita, and we'll find out more about that later on. I'll be introducing folks and hopefully singing about a film. So, mystery fans are always asking who done it. But in regards to crises covered by the corporate media, whether of the pandemic or Hurricane Ida, it's frustrating. Even when they seem sympathetic to working and poor peoples, they do their best to hide the most pertinent information. Who done it? And how do we stop them? So it's very frustrating if you're a mystery fan or anyone trying to find a solution. Take, for example, this write-up in CNN by Mitch Landrieu, who was a former mayor of New Orleans, a former lieutenant governor of Louisiana, and a CNN political commentator. He correctly points towards some of the reasons for the devastation of Hurricane Ida and Katrina in 2005 regarding the destruction of the coastline. But instead of pointing the finger at specific industries, he blames, quote unquote, human activity. Well, I guess that's you and me and other working class people who have no say in what the companies that lay pipelines and destroy marshes and forests do, since we don't own or control them and can't even really vote on what they do. Then possibly out of ignorance, we're told that the lives lost are inevitable, since the speed of the storm was, quote, meant that the speed of the storm meant that well-designed plans to get people out of harm's way could not be utilized. Consider what is needed for evacuation: transportation, lodging, food, medicines, and work flexibility. Those with financial means got out of town. Those without means had to ride it out in severe conditions. Now, he points out that the success of the levees in New Orleans in keeping people safe, but also mentioned that in places like La Place in Louisiana, one of the only two districts in Louisiana with the highest Black and brown populations, that they didn't fare so well since their levee repair is just now getting started. He goes on to say that the racial and economic inequality determined the severity of the crisis on peoples, but gives no reason why the situation exists and by whom. Just the way things are, I guess. Nobody done it. Instead, he writes how the solution will take a long time to figure out, and we just all have to be smarter. And quote, we must strike a balance between human needs and the environment that surrounds us, while also combating the chronic stresses of violence, poverty, and inequality. Still no whodunit, but a definite statement about our human needs being the same as the needs of the corporations. So, see, there is a whodunit, according to them. We all done it. Now, if that is true, then why would the working class, especially the poor in New Orleans and Louisiana, especially the Black members of our class, allow themselves to get hit so much harder by storms of Katrina and Ida, and not just by the storm itself either? I'm curious because I was part of an International Tribunal on Katrina and Rita on August 29th of 2007 that exposed the genocidal policies and criminal neglect of the city, state, and federal authorities. This was a well-attended and international tribunal with tribunal judges from Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, France, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and the US. And the conveners traveled from Algeria, Brazil, South Africa, and different US cities. We heard testimony and saw video evidence of deadly racist policies, like then Governor Blanco instructing the National Guard to shoot to kill so-called looters trying to secure food for their babies, which empowered white supremacist gangs to terrorize and shoot at Black residents, and the killing by white cops using assault weapons to shoot at Black people trying to escape flooded waters by crossing the Danziger Bridge, and the deadly treatment of prisoners waiting in waste-infested waters and not allowed to be released, all to protect the private property of multinational corporations like Walmart and the selfish, racist insecurities of wealthier white communities. The tribunal was supported by many national and international organizations and was attended by hundreds of survivors of both hurricanes, along with political and community activists from around the country and the world. But the media boycotted this unprecedented event because it was clear in pointing out who did it, and it wasn't us. Well, this webinar will not be a continuation of corporate media and politicians enabling capitalism and its resulting devastation against our class to hide the basic contradictions, allowing the situation and the worsening of this situation in regard to the environment and the lack of preparedness, hiding the fact that this is systemic and an intrinsic part of the profit motive driving capitalist structures. To say that the situation is complicated ignores the fact. And when the solutions are being utilized over and over again in socialist countries, that ignorance is dishonest at best. It's no secret that in regards to doing what is necessary to save lives, the socialist countries do not hesitate to use resources against natural and unnatural disasters. They use mass education to the populace at risk, free transportation to whisk them away from danger, infrastructure repairs, and sufficient advanced preparation before a crisis. In other words, they utilize the means of production of a society to prioritize people's needs, not the profits of corporate monopolies. But exposing this would add to the pressure this rotten system of capitalism is increasingly feeling from the people getting stabbed by it on a daily basis, whether it be from the neglect of the environment or a denial of basic health care. So that's the viewpoint that we'll be presenting. And let's see, I believe I'm first going to be introducing Reverend Chambers, who is Reverend Annie Chambers, is the co-chair of the Welfare Rights Organization and People's Power Assembly organizer. And she's going to give an account from members on the ground in New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you, Reverend Chambers.
Thank you. Yes. Katrina was really destruction. And the people feels, especially poor and working people feel that they were the hardest hit, worst destruction you could think of. And then, but they continued to say that they would bounce back. They would come back. Welfare rights, along with some other groups, got together, and they've been getting people to move back into New Orleans and come back to New Orleans because they were scattered all over the country. People lost their family members. I was told a story about a man and his wife, and they were raising 5 of their grandchildren, and the water came up so bad, he was trying to save his wife who couldn't swim, and the children were small, and his wife told him to just go take the children, and he lost his wife in Katrina, and she drowned. He has not bounced back yet. I was introduced to him when I was in New Orleans this year. And this particular man has not bounced back yet. He's no longer able to care for even his grandchildren, because that was a terrible loss to see his wife. Look back and see your wife drowning, and you could do nothing but try to hold on to these children to get them out of arm's reach. So that stuck with me, that particular story. But this particular time around, we look at a different situation. The federal government could have done better, I feel, and I'm getting reports out of New Orleans every day of how people are dying for the lack of, from the heat. People are dying for the lack of water. People are dying for the lack of health care. that they don't have any of these things. And people can't get their medicines. Or even on the news, NBC News, they reported that there was a man just laying there dying because he could not get his leukemia medicine, but they aided him and got him to a hospital, and then the hospital wouldn't take him. So they insisted when he got some medications to help this man. But that's just one story, and I've been told there's several stories. There are women giving birth that can't get into hospitals, that babies are dying. People just literally in no electricity. If there's oxygen, there's people that need assistance. So this have hit, I feel, better than Katrina, because people are literally suffering, and I wanted to know where was the president, what aid that they were sending to these people, and they were slow about sending them any kind of aid. No, when you don't have, you're an elderly person and there's no air conditioning, anybody really, there's no air condition, or, and you're sick, and the hospitals were turning away people. They couldn't accept people. But right now in Katrina, we didn't have COVID. Now we got COVID. And it's really, really, really bad in New Orleans. New Orleans already had a pretty rough break, in the COVID in the first place. And now it's even worse because, I talked to someone who had lost 8 of their family members to COVID during this time. 8 people, because they couldn't get any treatment. And so if you're a poor and working class person, Black and brown people in New Orleans, as we speak, is suffering, literally suffering on the ground. And you hear very little about it in the news. And the president has, he went there and handed somebody a toy or something junk. I don't know, but I know from tenants in public housing that it is really bad for them also. That so people have not gotten the assistance that they would and should have, at this particular time. And I have not heard Joe Biden say or do anything other than, they're gonna assist, they giving money, FEMA, this. Well, we already had people living in trailers. They had never bounced back from Katrina. And so people, now, where do they go? Where do they live? People are laying on the street dying in New Orleans right now. Right now. That's what I'm told by my welfare rights, people. I'm told by my the president of the organization down there in New Orleans that they're having a very, very hard time getting help and support, and if there's so much money and support sent to New Orleans, it need to get to the people. That I'll end with that for right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Reverend Chambers. Those important words, because we aren't seeing that. We're not seeing that in the corporate media.
In the news.
Seeing that. So thank goodness we have a chance to be able to find out what's actually going on. So next, we'd like to bring up, and we're going to have discussion, question and answer discussion and things after our next speaker, who is Gregory Williams, who's a writer for Struggle Lucha for Socialism. And he's a Louisiana resident, and he'll be giving a firsthand account. Thank you so much, Gregory, for being with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Like John said, I'm from Louisiana. I'm actually from Tangipahoa Parish, which is on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain, opposite New Orleans. However, I've lived in New Orleans for about 6 years. Before Ida hit, I went back to Tangipahoa, partly to be with family and partly because I thought it would be safer. And this really turned out not to be the case. I mean, we were up there, we were subjected to intense winds with trees and light poles snapping all over the place. I had a family member who fell during the storm and broke his hip, and the paramedics couldn't come until the next day. So he was, basically down on the ground, unable to be moved for the duration of the storm. And he's now miraculously. But after the weather had cleared up, I could see that the damage was extensive throughout the town. Where my father lived, I counted 10 fallen trees, most of these gigantic old oaks in a single acre. And that was pretty much typical of what the whole town looked like. And that being said, what I want to do is just to bring attention to a few areas of concern that I think are significant, things that I've been following, and I think we should keep our eyes on in terms of how to respond and really how to organize in the coming period. So this is going to be a list, sort of not exhaustive, of course. Then I want to just raise some questions about organizing and revolution given the current state of capitalism, and which is not just about capitalist crises, but a crisis of capitalism. That is the long-term decline of this system and what it means for working people trying to survive. And the fact that working class people and oppressed people are continually subjected to catastrophes. So this, in no particular order, we should note just from a climatological perspective, in terms of the storm, what scientists are saying is they're calling it, and they're talking in terms of rapid intensification of these storms. Because of climate change, storms can get very strong, very fast. And this is what happened with Ida. The temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico were several degrees above average. So the storm was able to just keep sucking up heat energy and becoming stronger and stronger. And because the coastline is receding because of industry, because of, capitalist exploitation, it really made landfall in wetlands. So this was not dry land. And so it was continuing to suck up water. And that's why it was, basically so strong and was able to cross the country to the point where it could kill people all the way in New York. Some points about the environmental impact. As of September 8th, there were 2,000 oil and chemical spills reported to the Coast Guard. For example, a broken pipeline near Port Fourchon where the storm made landing, and that produced an 11-mile sheen. The number of reports so far suggest that the impact could be bigger than the spills that followed after Katrina, where there were roughly 11 million gallons of oil that were spilled in total, and basically the same amount that was released by the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska. Possible Reverend Chambers mentioned the COVID. So possible exacerbation of COVID before the storm. COVID infection rates in Louisiana were already some of the worst in the country, even though there had been a slight decline since the high of early August when there were 3,022 people in hospitals with COVID across the state. So I have a neighbor who, she just received a lot of damage to her home, but she also has an elderly mother down in Homa who still doesn't have power, and the neighbor in New Orleans, and her daughter is still on oxygen from COVID. So just imagine kind of experiencing all these things at once. Some epidemiologists have warned that reduced testing in the aftermath of the storm and the lax protocols as people are evacuating and huddled down together could cause a spike in infections. And even in my own family, there 3 people tested positive after Ida hit, and I had direct contact with 2 of them. I've been in the same house with 2 of them. So the effects of these conditions on hospitalization, it's yet to be seen, but that's something to watch. Tribal communities. A lot of these indigenous people in Louisiana are concentrated on the coast. And the destruction, it seems to be pretty uniform throughout the whole coast area. A lady by the name of Tammy Greer, who is a United Homa Nation citizen, was able to survey the coast by plane, and she reported this one was so spread out. Usually it's only 1 or 2 communities that are usually it's only 1 or 2 communities. This time everybody else, it doesn't matter where you're looking. So the Pointe-au-Chien tribe, which is the Homa Nation, the Biloxi Chicamaca Confederation, all of these tribal communities have been hit. And as far as assistance goes, this can be very problematic, because a lot of these tribes they might be recognized by the state of Louisiana, but they're not recognized federally. So that becomes a problem with them trying to receive any kind of assistance. So, I think that's going to be something that we should watch in the coming period. That's going to be an extended struggle for them to get assistance. Just thinking about the scale in the big picture, the scale of the damage beyond New Orleans. Right now, there are about 14,000 people who've lost their homes in Lafourche Parish, which is to the south of New Orleans. So, basically the parish government over there is saying that 75% of structures are damaged or destroyed. I think that means not just houses, but everything, convenience stores, grocery stores, whatever. In St. John the Baptist Parish, they received 17 inches of rainfall and 5 feet of storm surge. They reported 800 people had to be rescued. For New Orleans, I'd say the biggest issue, as with other areas, but fortunately the water wasn't as bad here this time around because the levees did hold up, thankfully. But the big issue is going to be this long-term economic fallout. And what I mean is, in the midst of the pandemic, where so many service industry jobs have been lost, people are missing out on work again, they're being displaced again, and so on. God forbid that you've been impacted by every one of these different crises. Just imagine, say you're a worker who lost a job during the pandemic, and then you have to navigate the constantly changing situation with the schools, because you have kids in schools that are trying to go back. You might have family members who've been sick with COVID. You might have lost a partner or a sibling, or there are people who've lost almost their whole families, due to COVID. And now imagine a tree has fallen on your house or your rental home, and you're scrambling, trying to get in touch with FEMA. This is a nightmare for working class people. And like Reverend Chambers said, a big issue has been the power outages. And we know in New Orleans, the power there's a monopoly on energy with the Entergy Corporation. It's not a publicly owned service. And we've had discussions that we should be advocating for people's takeover of energy. I mean, the past example was setting up, as Gary has brought this up in Struggle with Lucha, setting up the Tennessee Valley Authority during the Great Depression. This is something that's possible. These public these utilities should be public. That's not something that's just pertinent to Louisiana. We saw that with Texas recently, the ERCOT system, where 4 million customers went without power in the winter storm back in February this year. In California, they have PG&E, which is an investor-owned utility company, and they're constantly dealing with rolling blackouts, and that's the norm. And we should also just note that public ownership, if we had that, that would make converting to cleaner energy a lot easier. I mean, for example, in Vietnam, the electricity grid, as well as oil and gas. All these things are state-owned, controlled by the people in some way. So the socialist government can plan and direct those entities and say, well, we want to have such and such amount of the energy coming from solar by 2025 and so on, and they can implement that. And we should be able to have that here. I mean, so much of the suffering, it has been caused by the failure of the electricity grid, which has been, a big issue for, anybody who's ill or elderly. It becomes more and more problematic for those people. Having access to air conditioning, losing all the food that you had in your refrigerator, and not being able to cook if you have an electric oven and so on. I mean, but on the other hand, if you look at Entergy itself, they had total assets of 58.239 billion in 2000, and they're now asking the city council to improve increasing charges to customers to cover the cost of the storm. Now, over the summer, they had already, the council already approved a 10 to 20% rate increase. The CEO, Leo Denault, had an estimated net worth of 29.5 million in 2018. So if there are more rate increases, that's going to hit the poor working class people the hardest. So they're basically demanding that that working class people, pay the bill to do any kind of infrastructure upgrades that they've failed to do because they've always put their own profits ahead. So that's a sort of a general sketch of some of what's going on here. And I haven't touched on, it's not exhaustive, but I wanted to step back a little bit and kind of talk about the general trends. I think we can see that the general pattern of how things go in terms of these crises are going to keep playing out in a similar way. There'll be variations here and there, but the crises are happening over and over again. And I think we should think of them as compounding crises. I mean, look at New Orleans, and the city can kind of stand in for the rest of the country in a certain way, as an example. What does it mean that a population that was impacted by Katrina in 2005, then hit with the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, now the pandemic, now Ida. And every time the capitalist ruling class and their politicians let the masses suffer, there's a recovery, so-called recovery that looks good on paper or according to the stock market, but the recovery leaves the population behind. We know after the financial crisis, the economy supposedly recovered, but people's wages didn't go up, benefits didn't increase. After Katrina, there was a glittering recovery for the tourism industry and for some nonprofits and maybe some tech startups, or I don't know what. It was a brilliant success for the landlords and the hedge funds and real estate moguls. But a lot of working class people, especially Black working class people, never could return. And lots of working people have been pushed into the suburbs where they, now have to rely on an inadequate bus system to get to their jobs in the French Quarter, to work in those hotels, so on. The school system was completely privatized. Public housing was mostly demolished. Before there was such a thing as working class home ownership and Black working class home ownership here. But now, just on my block, there's only one household where the family was actually here before Katrina. And that tells you something. Across the street, there's 3 houses all owned by the same landlord. The house behind me is owned by a hedge fund based in Rhode Island or someplace like that. And that's really the new New Orleans, the Katrina recovery New Orleans. So there really has never been an actual recovery as far as the working people are concerned, now being hit by these new crises. Each time a crisis hits, our communities do bounce back, sure, but under worse conditions. Even just to take the example of the public housing, New Orleans used to have a lot more public housing that was totally just dismantled after Katrina. And there's some things you really can't see from just looking at the statistics, these intangible things about community. Like I've had coworkers who are in their 40s and 50s who working in the school system, cafeterias, and they've told me things about, what it was like when they were growing up in the housing projects in New Orleans, and there were problems that are, all those problems are exaggerated in the media, but there was also community there. So even if you might have had issues in your family, but there was maybe, Mrs. Brown, who lived in the same complex, who's been there for 30 years, and she's like the grandmother to everyone. She knows everybody's family. There's somebody to look after you. But what happens when all those people were scattered? That whole world that they lived in, and they knew that was part of their resilience, part of their ability to survive, was destroyed. And that's kind of what these crises do. Each time they're taking away more and more. And people say, well, capitalism is dynamic and it can find an opportunity out of any crisis. Yes, but only up to a certain point. And Lenin talks about revolutionary situations where people can't live in the old way anymore. The ruling class can't rule in the old way. Basically, something has to give. We may not be there yet, but the trajectory is kind of clear that things are getting worse and worse. And we just have to ask, how much more could people possibly take? So my final thought is just a question of what kind of organizing do we need in the coming period? They've dispersed us, the capitalists, the politicians, they've dispersed our communities, but how do we then pull together and fight back given these deteriorating conditions? How to be creative and thinking, not just reacting to things, but actually being able to plan and kind of take the upper hand and strategize, not just reacting. And so I appreciate Reverend Chambers talking about the work of the Welfare Rights Union. I think that's somewhere that we could look to of how people are organizing at this time. Also, the Unemployed Workers Union in Maryland, and Sharon has played a role in that, helping people to get their benefits. That's the reality of what we're going to be dealing with. It's kind of like in the Great Depression when they were tenants were stopping evictions, and I don't know what else, marches of sharecroppers. Have to think creatively of how to fight back, and that's kind of just what I want us to focus on in the coming period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gregory. And that's the point of this whole exercise we're doing here, and the point of the speakers and everything is like someone once said, the point is to change it. We're going to get the information, but we want to organize. We want to use that information to help build a movement to stop these crises. We're going to have some questions and things like that. I see someone in the chat at Shane had said something about the Entergy, one of the big Fortune 500 companies that Greg was referring to, at supplies the electric power, that they doubled their rates since last year when they updated their meters. So like Gregory was saying, they're using these crises to maximize profits, whether it's for gentrification or whatever else. But it's also clear that these profits, these things that they're doing, thanks to the testimonies of Reverend Chambers and Gregory, that they're less and less effective in hiding who the culprits are. Because when, like I was talking about that CNN article about saying that, the storm happened so fast, there's nothing they could do about it. And never once mentioning the fact that Venezuela and Cuba were lending a hand during the Katrina crisis, and many of these crises that we were affected, whether it's COVID or anything. And during the Katrina crisis, they were lending a hand. And I'm just going to show you this little picture I got here. 1 second. While we read the questions, see if it works. Shoot. Let's see. Did it work?
It worked, John.
You see it? Yeah. Now, guess what that's a picture of? I mean, you see all these bags and stuff. Is it a military invasion or something that's happening or whatever it is? No, it's about 1,600 Cuban healthcare workers and other workers, technical workers, who were ready. We're going to get to the airport, ready to go to Katrina to help the situation and help the people there. And they weren't allowed to. Just like in Venezuela was going to send generators and things like that and things to help the people. They weren't allowed to. The Bush administration said, no, you're not allowed to help. So the solutions are there. Some of the solutions are there, but they don't want these solutions because maybe the crisis serves to help maximize profits, which is now we have let's see, I got a question here just from Alec. Just wanted to ask the panelists about a comparison between how Cuba handles natural disasters versus the US. Hurricane Maria comes to mind as juxtaposed to Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston. That's one thing. Okay, we'll start with that one. Anybody want to tackle that? Let me mute because my puppy here is making noise.
Yes. When we look at the services and how the US, I don't want to put myself in it. I don't want to say we. I know I live here. I was born here. And they tell me I'm a citizen here. But anyway, how they deal with it is that, first of all, in Cuba, you could always get some kind of support and aid. In America, you got all this, first of all, red tape. You got people laying in the street dying, and you talking about a small country like Cuba, where there are not people laying out dying in the street for the like of assistance and healthcare. And none of the people, the presidents that we had to, both Katrina and Ida, did nothing to help poor and Black, brown people in this country, for as I'm concerned. When I say that in public housing, it gave them a chance to steal some land because public housing was on some of the land that was not touched by Katrina. But they took it under their offices that this is not safe. But now there's some more houses there that poor people can't live in because they can't afford them. And this is happening, all over America at this time. That didn't happen in Cuba. Look at New York. Right now, people suffering and was dying on the street from this last hurricane. And again, I will repeat, the president of the United States of America, good old, because I get mad with some of my people that calls him Uncle Joe. Good old Joe have not reached out with assistance, and they play political games with the money. That is not happening. That didn't happen in Cuba. So there's a big difference in other countries, Venezuela, a lot of places do not treat disaster like the people here in America. The people here in America, the powers that be, will go to the very wealthy first to see if they have, if they need assistance. And just even with this last bout of COVID, with COVID, it was rich people who was getting vaccinated against COVID. Wealthy people, long before they just reached down and picked up people like me. We were out there fighting to get vaccinated. And now they're hollering about everybody should be vaccinated. Well, where was they, where was, and we had to demonstrate, talk about going to jail and everything else to get vaccinated. And this is that COVID is a disaster right here in our country right now. And look how it's being treated. Now they saying people need the third shot. And who they saying getting it first? It is not poor people. It is not the poor working class. So again, there's a big difference in between the way people get treated here in this country and other countries.
Absolutely.
And especially Cuba, because Cuba does take care of its citizens, even with that embargo around it. I got the best healthcare in the world when I was in Cuba. And did not cost me anything. That's how they take care of their citizens.
I actually shared that same experience when I was in Cuba years ago. I had gotten sick and
years ago, me too.
Got no money, no nothing. They didn't take it. They just took care of the problem.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, should I go on to the next question? I think we have a question from Gregory, from Greg, sorry, not Gregory. Says, what kind of preparations were made by city, state, and federal officials to evacuate New Orleans, if any? In New York, although the storm was known to be coming days ahead of time, there was not preparation or evacuation. Many people living in basement apartments died as a result. Anyone want to comment on that tragedy that occurred in New York and what happened in New Orleans this time?
There really wasn't much in terms of attempts to get people out of the city. I mean, the city issued a mandatory evacuation for people outside the levee system, so some of these surrounding areas, and then they strongly suggested that people within the city limits get out. But I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but a lot of working class people don't have vehicles. So, it's not like they had buses that were taking people out of the city. And that seems like what we would need at this point, especially if the storms can develop that fast. You have to have a plan in place to get people out fast. So it's just like a whole hodgepodge of things. Like, I'm sure some of you have followed the story about the nursing home disaster that happened here. And that was kind of a regional thing where this a nursing home mogul who lives in Baton Rouge owns, like, I don't know, 6 or 7 nursing homes, and some of them around New Orleans, but other areas. And he just had all the 800 nursing home residents just thrown into a warehouse. And the nurses who were in there were calling 911 frantically about the emergencies that were happening. And 4 people, as of what last I heard, 4 people died. One man had to get his leg amputated because he was left laying on it. Circulation was cut off, all this kind of thing. But that's the reality of it. It's sort of whatever people can figure out or whatever they can get away with, they do it. There's no plan of how to evacuate people, as there would be in Cuba, where they not only do they have aid after the fact, but they plan ahead, and they do, to my understanding, they do drills throughout the year that involve every sector of society, like what they have a 100-year plan for moving people out of some of the most dangerous coastal areas. They look ahead with their social planning system, where we have very short vision. Well, I shouldn't say we, but the capitalist class, all they see is what's ahead of them, and they leave the working class scrambling to live day to day, to where none of us can really plan ahead, and that's a tragedy.
That's right. Anybody else on that? Okay, let's go to the next question here from Gloria. With the high temperatures, are there any places for people with no generators or electricity to go get relief from the heat?
I don't know of anything.
Well, this is what I was told by welfare rights and the president there, Viola Washington, was that people were passing out from the heat so bad and having heat strokes and you know, very ill people, that some people were putting them into cars just to get a, you know, relief from the heat, or put them in a bus that had, you know, for the air condition, you know, to get some kind of a heat. Because remember, as they claim, the whole grid was down, so people didn't get any. There were no fans couldn't work, and air conditions couldn't work, and they even tried to reach out to some of the hotels and ask if they would help. The last I heard from her, there had been no aid. Nobody came to their aid to help people that was very heat stroke and very sick.
Sorry. So we've got about 10 more minutes left of questions and answer. I see someone had a question about, as we were talking about, you know, trying to build a movement and things like that. Many of the folks, including Reverend Chambers and others in Baltimore, have been involved in saving the unemployment benefits of workers in Baltimore. Had made a huge success in the courts and other things like that, and it's being used as it's a great example of how to try to build a movement to fight these attacks from the ruling class. And so someone that just had a question about, I think Sharon was going to answer them in the chat about the unemployment workers union that is in Baltimore, and if it's also in other cities as well, in New York and the things. You want to actually let me take it to Sharon. Sharon, you want to answer that?
Sure. Actually, I was going to wait until I introduced the film, but yes, to the person who raised that question, very good question. In fact, it kind of makes us feel like we need to do a webinar on that alone nationally, which we've been talking about in terms of the unemployed workers union here in Maryland, because it's I wouldn't say it's a complicated story, but it's certainly a complex story. There's a lot to it. And yes, we would welcome people in New York City, the New York State, different other states to take up organizing unemployed workers unions in their own area. In all humbleness, I want to say that, you know, we've done some incredible work and we won the unemployment benefits. You know, we forced the governor to continue with the federal pandemic benefits, but we have been barraged. And so I say with humbleness, we have yet to completely set up our website. There's a lot of structural issues, including constitution, stuff like that, that we have not yet been able to tackle. And so we're behind, very frankly. And at our last meeting, people were talking about the very issue that the comrade raised, you know, and that is how to make this a national effort, mostly because we've gotten in a lot of calls and a lot of people on Facebook, texting, you know, calling us on the phone about what we can do to help them in states like Mississippi, out in the West, Virginia, we've gotten calls from all across the country. So I didn't want to turn this into a discussion on the unemployed workers union, but I thank you, John, for giving me this opportunity before we go into the film showing part. And this doesn't answer the question fully. Just yes, it would be great if there's other people in New York who want to connect with each other. We can certainly share, what our practice has been here and what we've done. And in all honesty, it started with a humble group of people who were unemployed and didn't have their benefits. And we had picket lines and events at the unemployment office, and then it snowballed and grew. And now it's like we have thousands of people contacting us.
Yeah. Okay. I guess we got another 5 minutes left for discussion. Then we're going to try to show the film. But just let's see. There was another comment by Shane. It says raising wages would alleviate some of the issues like inaccessibility to evacuation. Yet we have seen Biden and Harris time and time again not fight for it and make excuses as to why they can't at this time. In the same breath, they will say they support raising wages. It's unbelievably terrible for them to treat the American people in this way. Kind of reminds me of what the other folks were saying too, about how the solutions are right there in front of them. I mean, how much, speaking of, it's not rocket science, and, speaking of rockets, how did, how much did Bezos and Richard, whatever his name is from Virgin Galactic, how much did they spend on their rockets, their little joyride to not even to space, to just the upper atmosphere? How much did they spend on that? I think 6 billion was Bezos's. I might be wrong about that. So it's probably about the same on the other one. But that money could have been used to, instead of rocketing people to the sky, they could have, drove people to safety or made shelters to safety, or build the hospitals that China was able to build in a couple of weeks in order to help fight the COVID crisis and, all these other things. So solutions are there, but it's going to take us to make it happen, to build that movement. Any other comments, folks, before we go to the film?
Well, I think people need it. We need a national organizing all over this country, because nothing's going to change until we wipe out poverty. Poverty in America is a business. It's a business. That's what poverty is in this country. And until we wipe it out, we can, taunt at all the things that's happening in America. And it's, when people say to me, well, how do we stop crime? Poverty, fight poverty. The question, $15 an hour is what everybody's hollering for. That's not enough. That's not enough for people to live on with the cost of the greedy people that we have raised everything. The day we had a big talk on food, just food alone. You used to could buy a chicken for $4. Now you can't buy the chicken for $10. All of these things, eggs. When COVID first hit, the stores jumped on and made food so high. Eggs were $8 and $9 a dozen. All these things. And when it come out of Washington, those little let's give them something to be quiet for the moment, because that's what they're doing with these extra food stamps and all the stuff that they giving people now. And I'm telling people it's not gonna last. It's not gonna last. They know that if people get to the point, and I say to public housing tenants, I say to people who ask me about getting somewhere to live, when you gonna stand up? That's what we got to do. We got to build an international for America, a national demonstration, a national movement, a real movement of the people, for the people. That's what we got to build. And until we do that, we're going to continue to get piecemeal and beat down and beat out, because it pays for some people to have poverty in America.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And we have some great examples of how to build that unity.
Yes.
From many folks. Saw this film about Fred Hampton, about how he was getting people to realize that they have more in common. Working and poor people have more in common with themselves than they do with the ruling class. We need to unite on that basis and fight. There's another comment just said, "Thank you for your answer, Reverend Chambers. In Texas, people went to their cars for heat and to charge cell phones. Unfortunately, the people died of carbon monoxide. As with this crisis, no one came to check on people, not in this country." So I guess we're ready to try to attempt to show the film.
Yes.
We'll see.
Well,
Okay,
I think I'm, can you hear me, John?
I hear you. Sure.
Yeah, I was going to give a brief sort of summary of the film, and then we're going to try to show it. And I'll say this for transparency's sake, in our practice session, it didn't work, but it worked before that. And so we're going to see, actually, people should, let us know in chat or what have you, text me.
So
Let us know.
you're a little bit soft there.
Okay.
Say that again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. The Reverend and me are working on the same speaker system. So I just wanted to say, for transparency's sake, when we first showed this in the practice session, we failed. But we're kind of still want to be optimistic that we can show this. But I was supposed to give a brief sort of summary of the film and say a few things, because like Comrade John, I went to New Orleans after Katrina. And I tell you, the movie, when I watched the film, it brought back the memories of, I wouldn't call it trauma, the terror that people went through. And for those of us who are older that are on this call, people remember Katrina. People remember the horror, the little horror of seeing people on their roofs with big signs saying, "Help me, help me," and no one was there to help them. And I'm saying this before the film because the film does a good job of showing this part. And that is that we have to remember, September 11th was just yesterday, which began the whole quote unquote war on terror by the imperialists, endless war. And one of the things that comes out in the film, which is so very true, and that we have to say over and over again, is there was no National Guard that came to the rescue of people in time. I mean, eventually the National Guard came there to stop, quote unquote, from people from liberating goods and food, etc. But the reality was that the National Guard from that region was in Iraq. So literally, people got back, some of these National Guards people who could not save people because they were fighting the Pentagon's war in Iraq. When they got back, they didn't have houses. And so it was a kind of double-edged sword that, people didn't get any kind of assistance. And Bush, who was the president at that point, obviously, those who remember, kept saying, "Oh, we can do both. We should do both, kill people in Iraq and let people die in New Orleans." That was really the story. And it was genocide. And I tell you, I still feel very emotional about it, because when we went to New Orleans, we could still see the water where it had risen to the houses. You could still see houses that were marked X for either destruction or places where people were dead inside. And so the movie itself, just so people know, is I personally found it very interesting, and a lot of it reminds me of Baltimore City, where I live at. And the two people that are the central characters in the film, or also the film people who filmed it, was a young woman who was a rap artist. Um, I think, as I recall, went by the name of Cold Medina. And it was her narration and her film where she actually filmed when they were up in the attic and the survival and also the neighborhood. So it's a very, very moving story. And most of the video footage comes directly from the two folks that I'm referring to that lived in the 9th Ward, who bought, as I read later, this video camera for $20 right before the storm struck. So we're going to try to show it. We may not be successful. If we're not, we will not be deterred. We will come back. And since people signed up, we will send you another email out and we will show it again through Zoom. We have been able to show movies in Zoom in the past, and we actually downloaded so we wouldn't be taking up the extra bandwidth in our Wi-Fi. But it also may be that in this brief period, because it happens all the time, that the capitalist copywriters and have made the hooked up with Zoom, which we considered a private showing, like what would be in John Parker's living room or Reverend Chambers' living room. That's why we were not live streaming it on Facebook to avoid any kind of copyright problems. But that could be the problem, or it just could have been a Zoom glitch where it didn't show on our side. So we're going to try it with a little bit of patience to show this film. And if those who are watching, you don't get to see it, please don't fear, we'll try it again. So I've been here more as a technical person, but I did want to say, those few words about the film and about Katrina. And, none of this, and just to end my own comments, is like, none of this is a, what do you call it? A crisis of nature, just a natural disaster, or quote, what does the insurance people say, an act of God. Of course, the hurricanes are a natural crisis, but they're made by capitalist climate change and climate, and they're made, the failure to respond the way that they don't respond is basically also made by the system itself, because it's different in Cuba. And we will have a video where some folks who are very much experts on how Cuba handles storms can clearly see the difference, how people are evacuated, how people are treated, even how animals are treated in the Cuban system. So it's not like it has to be this way. I think Reverend Chambers said it well, Gregory, John, all the comrades in this call said it extremely well. It does not have to be this way. And, we will make that revolution, and it's going to take a lot, but we will definitely do it, because capitalism has to be discarded, abolished, and put in the dustbin of history. And we do need socialism. And let me go try to see if we can show this film. And I'm hoping that people on chat will tell me if it didn't come through. So let us have a little patience and we will see.